we're gonna go ahead and start. We'll catch Assemblywoman McKnight when she gets up here. She's very critical to this discussion, though, as the CCRB bill in the state is her bill that she co-authored, but she is definitely the progenitor of that. We have a great panelist this morning talking about the necessity of a civilian complaint review board here in the state of New Jersey. Right now, Newark is the only city that has a CCRB, and obviously other cities are in the wings waiting until they find out what happens here in order to go forward. But we have, as I said, Honorable Angela McKnight, District 31, New Jersey General Assembly, General State Assembly here on her way upstairs. The Honorable Adrian Mapp, and there's Assemblywoman right here, right on time. Honorable Adrian Mapp, Mayor of the City of Plainfield. Honorable Andre Saya, who's following me, Mayor of Patterson. At every panel, he's here with me. And Honorable Dahlia Vertrice, who is the mayor of the city of Hillside, our neighbor in Newark. And I'm going to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and start us off with a brief introduction about why they think the Civilian Complaint Review Board is a necessity here in the state of New Jersey. The league's executive board just voted this morning to support legislation around Civilian Complaint Review Board in the state of New Jersey. So that's a big victory for us. And they represent all elected officials throughout the state, so that's a huge victory. And having them advocate for us around this bill is going to be something tremendous. So we'll start with Mayor Say and go on down. Introduce yourself, talk a little bit about why you think it's necessary to have a Civilian Complaint Review Board.
Good morning, Andre Saya, Patterson, New Jersey. Mayor Ras Baraka's second favorite city in the state of New Jersey. But I'm the president of your fan club, right? And we're accepting applications. The operative word is accountability. If we've learned anything from the tragic murder of George Floyd, accountability should be prioritized now more than ever. And let me talk about Patterson specifically. We've had 8 officers that we had to have removed because of conduct that was unbecoming to the uniform. As a matter of fact, we just had a recent incident where an officer assaulted an unarmed man, and the only reason why we knew about it is because of body cameras. And we never had body cameras in Patterson before until December of 2020. I was adamant about it because it is about accountability for both the officer and the individual involved in the interaction. So ultimately, accountability will be the order of the day. And now we're going to be outfitting almost every police officer in Patterson with body cameras just for that very reason. And that officer, we took an unprecedented measure, and I have my corporation counsel, Amy Bushi, with me. We fired him. Normally you have to wait. These individuals are put on suspension and paid. So we said, no, this man needs to be terminated. And so we took that bold and, like I stated before, unprecedented action, and we fired that officer for dishonoring the uniform and our police department and our community. But it goes beyond the body cameras and the Civilian Review Board, which we need obviously to increase accountability. But also, we're doing an audit of our police department, top to bottom, to see how we can improve on how we protect and serve our community. And we want to emphasize community policing more, how we can immerse ourselves inside of the public that we need to trust us, because ultimately, in addition to accountability, it's about trust between the public and the police. And also want to mention something that we've been focusing on, because we've seen a recent uptick in gun violence, and bail reform has served a purpose. But there's something other urban mayors and I, a component of bail reform that we focused on, which is the gun possession component. Very often people are released right back on the streets, and maybe the shooter or are shot as a result. So we're looking just to tweak that aspect of the bill. But as far as accountability is concerned, we've seen that body cameras work in Patterson. We are going to see with the audit what it tells us as far as the police department, where they are, and then a board that could help us get the community more involved and reestablish trust between the public and the police. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Dahlia Vertrice, Township of Hillside. One of the things that often confuses me is when you watch the news and they say things like, well, why does that happen here? Or how did that happen here? And we think that problems with policing and community policing only exists in cities. Hillside is 2.7 square miles, but it still has about 23,000 people inside that small town. We are bordered by cities, Union, Elizabeth, Newark, and Irvington. So we have a lot of the same problems, but they are easily ignored because we're not large, like Patterson or Newark. And so we still share their pain. As a matter of fact, my backyard is Newark in Hillside. And in Hillside, the history in the township regarding policing is still a very us versus them mentality. 4 different cities, 4 different cultures, many different subcultures and ethnicities in 2.7 square miles. So why we need a civilian complaint review board is very important to hear the feedback from people that are living in all of those different diverse communities within the 2.7 square miles. Sometimes, and I'll share this personal story with you, you don't need to hear the truth from the people you may see as oppressing you. And the people who are seen as oppressing you are also oppressed because they also have to live within their own circles and they need a safe space to explore what has happened as well. Our police officers, our men and women, need just as much protection from some of the systems that have plagued our communities for centuries as well. We need, again, civilians on patrol, citizens on patrol. It's an acronym for cops. And we've gotten away from that. We have become so accustomed to this quasi-military society that we're using weapons and tools that aren't even used abroad, that aren't even used by our military against people who are sworn enemies against us. So why are we using it in our own towns? 2.7 square miles. So first, we need to start addressing the us versus them mentality that even amongst our community members we exhibit. And of course, that translates into some of our police officers. We have police officers in leadership with a history of violence. We saw that with George Floyd. And all we could ask was, well, how did he have such a long rap sheet and no one noticed the patterns? People don't just wake up one day and shoot somebody. People don't just wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to put my knee on someone's neck and let the world watch because I know nothing is going to happen to me. This is something that happens gradually and over time. And this is why we need to reform how we are funding our police departments. We know that you need social workers. We know that we have people with autism and some mental illnesses that don't necessarily need police presence. Because when my 6-year-old son watches the Rayshard Brooks death and the very next morning goes to use the bathroom and he says, Mom, if I get arrested by the police, can I still ask questions? I said, well, why do you think that? I said, well, I just don't want to get shot. Now think about that. So now we're going to have police officers try to explain, no, this is not something, this is what the community can do to protect you. And it's not an anti-police reform, it's also protecting our community. Community policing needs our help and our input. And sometimes they just can't hear that message from you. Sometimes your identity precludes you from explaining what happens. And you do need that civilian support to make sure you're explicating it properly. We are concerned about the politics and targeting of officers as well. We don't want to see, and I know of police officers who have been targeted by politicians. And we don't want to see that on any civilian review board. So who is selected remains tantamount to the success of the program. It's very important that we monitor and adjust. So, and this is a common problem with legislation. We create legislation and then we never revisit it. We never see if this is the right fit for all townships. Maybe 7 people on a panel is too much for a town like Hillside. But we have to also be courageous enough to monitor and adjust. Is it a right fit? When we failed to do that in our policing systems, it led to the death of Sandra Bland. Because how you are executing police policies and procedures in Los Angeles is not necessarily what needs to be done in El Paso or in smaller towns like Hillside. We also need to examine the internal practices and pressures that also keep us from prioritizing even small crimes or things that are not as prioritized as gun violence. Gun violence is the extreme. Having people murdered is the extreme. But like I said, you don't just wake up one day and have bad things happen to you. Usually it happens in little small increments. So when you have a child who goes to a stadium to watch a football game and they go outside and they're beaten by 30 kids, go and making a complaint. What happened to my child? Oh, she just hugged another kid. Girlfriend got mad, waited for her outside, beat her to a pulp. Kid is now going to a neurologist for the next 6 months. And police should never be able to say, oh, well, you know, we got murders, we got all these other problems. I don't know when we're going to get to what happened to your kid. And then for the kid that beat that other kid up, what does that mean for them? That behavior goes unaddressed and unchecked, and it's going to get worse. Same thing happens with our police. So we need to be unified in this effort. That's my point. We need to make sure that we're not saying one crime is more valuable than another. They're all crimes. And so when we are going to reallocate our funds in the police department, we need to make sure that we are trying to nip it in the bud. And maybe that doesn't come from someone with police training. Maybe that comes from people who understand sociology, social work, behavioral sciences, realizing that the majority of our issues in Hillside are in domestic violence that we all know can escalate to gun violence. We have opioid addiction issues, speeding, package thefts. All of these things lead to major issues that, yes, homicides take up so much of our time, but these are issues that still need to be addressed, and the civilians still need a place to voice these concerns, and they deserve to have answers and a response. So I leave you with the support for this wonderful Civilian Complaint Review Board. I'm so happy to hear about the new news that it is going to be supported, and I'm anxious to hear about how our state is going to support the different municipalities who want the option to create one. Thank you.
Well, good morning to everyone. I'm going to be very brief. I don't want Sandman, who's standing behind me, to give me the hook. So, police officers are not our enemies. They're actually our friends, and we need them in order to provide a level of safety and security to our cities that we need. As Mayor of Plainfield, I must say that our police officers in Plainfield have a very good relationship with the community. And I have not heard of any incidents that would lead us to take action against any member of our Plainfield PD. So I want to first put that on the record. They do an excellent job protecting and serving. However, I never take anything for granted, and I don't say that it can't happen here. I recall listening to Mayor Lance Bottoms of Atlanta, and she said in the wake of the George Floyd incident and so many other things that were happening across the nation, that these kinds of things don't happen in Atlanta. And then within a matter of days, there was the killing of an unarmed black person in Atlanta who really was not doing anything to deserve his life being snuffed out. So it could happen at any time, any place, anywhere. And so I think that we have to put structures in place that would lead to police accountability. There has got to be a level of transparency that would give the community the comfort that someone is watching. We've got to boost the confidence in our residents so that they know that they will be protected and that people in elected positions will take the actions and the steps necessary to put things in place to ensure that our communities feel a level of safeness as they go about their daily business. We know that there are internal affairs departments in every police department, and they do what they think they have to do. But it is not enough to have internal affairs conducting investigations on their very own, because there exists that possibility that they will not do what is right, what is fair and just in holding bad cops accountable. It's the bad cops that we're talking about, and those are the ones where we need a civilian complaint review board. I believe that such a board is like a warning flag that is held up to let people know that there is some way that we could address an act that has occurred or something that is uncommon, something that poses a threat or a danger to the community. So I subscribe wholeheartedly, firmly to the notion of the creation of civilian complaint review boards. It is really a tool that we would have in our toolbox to ensure accountability and to provide our communities with a level, an additional layer of protection, protecting us from those bad officers who so often do some horrible things. There's no reason why we should have the lives of black and brown folks being snuffed out all across this nation. And cops for so many years, the bad cops, have not been held accountable. And we as citizens don't have the tool that will allow us to hold the bad cops accountable. And that's where a civilian complaint review board comes into play. I believe it is absolutely necessary for us to have the permissive ability to create civilian complaint review boards made up of citizens from across our city. In the wake of George Floyd, I created a George Floyd Police Reform Commission to look at our policing policies and practices. Even though I've said that our police officers in Plainfield do an admirable job in protecting and serving, but we can't turn our backs into thinking. We can't be lulled into a position of complacency where we believe that it will not happen in our cities and that our officers are above the law. So I created this commission made up of 10 members, a diverse group of residents that looked at our police practices, and the goal was for them to come up with recommendations that would be forwarded to the governor, the attorney general, and to the Union County prosecutor. And so at the end of the process, they did precisely that. They came up with a very good document that received compliments from the then Attorney General for the state of New Jersey. And one of the things that we found as this study was conducted is that mental illness is oftentimes the connection between an officer and a very unfortunate incident that happens in cities around the nation. It is because of mental illness that sometimes officers are called to the scene, and what happens is that a person ends up losing his or her life. So the role of mental illness is something that we cannot ignore, and as we look at policies across police departments, we have to keep that in mind, and we have to provide the resources that would allow cities to put measures in place to deal with mental illness. There isn't a need every time there's an episode on the part of a person to have a police officer come to the scene to deal with someone who is going through an episode related to his or her mental illness. So that has got to be a part of the reform that is needed, but at the end of the day, we must all push our elected officials in Trenton to do the absolute right thing and to allow us to create CCRBs. Not only to create CCRBs, but having a CCRB without subpoena power is like having a knife without a blade. And so we have to be given the ability to subpoena witnesses, and we have to be able to conduct our investigations concurrent with whatever Internal Affairs is doing. And so, as mayor of the city of Plainfield, I stand firmly on the side of the creation of a CCRB, and I look forward to having our members in the two houses in Trenton come up with an affirmative vote on the creation of CCRBs with subpoena powers. We look forward to that. Thank you.
Good morning. So first I want to preface that we are all humans. And throughout our life, we gain titles. And depending on the title you get, if you violate that title, you are held accountable. A woman who has a baby, if she abused that child, her child may be taken from her and she may end up in jail. So, police officers, they are humans with titles. And we have some bad police officers. And we are in 2021, and many of those bad police officers are not held accountable. On August the 19th, 2020, the Supreme Court of New Jersey struck down Newark's fight for a strong CCRB. They said that the legislature has to grant the appropriate powers. I want to commend Mayor Baraka and his team for fighting for a strong CCRB, and they continue to fight. A4656 is the first state legislation of its kind in New Jersey. And it was brought upon diverse group of people, stakeholders, elected officials, community organizations, police officers, and legislators. And that's how we formed this CCRB. I joined this journey after watching the brutal murder of George Floyd. It wasn't just the officer who had his knee on his neck. It was also the officers that stood and did nothing. And those are bad officers. And you have the officer who has over 17 complaints,
That's right.
and he was still on duty. When were they going to say enough is enough? So after watching that display, my team and I, we came together and we said, let's go. We have to do a CCRB. Now, full transparency, I was not aware that this man behind me was fighting the fight for a CCRB. We don't know everything, but when I saw George Floyd, I knew I had to do something. And I'm happy that the mayor and I and his team and my team and so many other stakeholders joined together for this fight. It was apparent, and it still is clear, that transparency and accountability, they're needed in the police department. I have a son. The end of this month, he's going to be 21 years old. And each and every day, my husband and I worry when he's going to work or he wants to go to a friend's house. Will we get that telephone call? I have nieces and nephews, and I also have constituents that we all worry. Police officers are supposed to be our friends. They're supposed to serve and protect. But we have some bad ones, and the good ones are not holding them accountable. If I see someone doing something wrong, I'm going to call them out on it. And I expect the good police officers to do that too. So this is why we need to have a CCRB. We need to have a CCRB so that we can bridge the gap, so that we can hold bad police officers accountable, and we can have more transparency in the police department as well as in the streets, because there are many people who don't want to go to the police department and tell them what they see because they are afraid, or they may be dismissive. I want to highlight some very pertinent things that's in this bill. This legislation will have full subpoena power. Without it, or part of it, it will not work. And the Supreme Court, they gave us the directive. So this is what I want to do. Follow their directive, because this is what they told us to do. So we need to have full subpoena power. This legislation will give municipalities the option is the key word, if they want to have a CCRB in their town. So it's not mandatory, it's an optional. This legislation will allow a setup of at least 3 members. The members shall be residents of the municipality with training or experience in community relations, civil rights, law enforcement, sociology, and other relevant fields. The ordinance shall specify the terms of each member, and each member and its employees will have to go through training before they even conduct any type of review. The CCRB will also adopt a conflict of interest policy. This legislation gives the CCRB the ability to recommend the establishment of policies by law enforcement and disciplinary actions. This legislation will give the ability to review any completed internal affairs investigation that is alleged that may have missed evidence of police misconduct or failed to properly discipline law enforcement officers' misconduct. This legislation allows CCRBs to review and investigate the conduct of any law enforcement officer that has a civilian complaint of excessive or unnecessary abuse of force, offensive language, or false misleading statements. And any person who is on the CCRB, if they divulge any information that they shouldn't, they will be charged a 4th-degree crime. So this is transparency and accountability on both ends. If you're on the board and you do something wrong, you will be held accountable. If we determine that the police officer has done something, then we will give those recommendations. So it's both ends of the spectrum. In addition, it will require the Attorney General Officer to establish protocols to operate concurrent investigations between the Review Board and an Internal Affairs unit. It will allow for various forms of review boards, including municipal, county, and smaller towns can join and create a joint CCRB. And also, it will require the Attorney General to develop a uniform electronic civilian complaint system for all police departments to upload the information. And, which I love, it appropriates $800,000 to help train the CCRB members. Also, if a recommendation is given to the Internal Affairs and they don't accept it, they have 60 days to let the CCRB know why they did not accept those recommendations. And there's a whole plethora of other things in this bill. But I'm here to tell you that with all the stakeholders, we have a great bill so that we can have a CCRB for accountability and transparency here in New Jersey. Let us be a leader and not a follower. We need it, and we need it now. And I want to once again thank Raz Baraka and his team for holding down the fight, because we all need to continue to fight. And I know at the end I will tell you some action items, because I have action items for you, because the fight is not just with me. The fight is with everyone in this room, everyone outside this room, anyone who will be watching. It's with all of us. So thank you, and I look forward to furthering the conversation.
That was great. So I don't know if everybody knows what a CCRB is. So before we go into the questions, I want to just really clarify that for folks who may not know what Civilian Complaint Review Board is. You know, Newark is under a consent decree. Before I took office, there was an investigation going on in the Newark Police Department, and the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, oversees what's called consent decrees, where they monitor police departments. Part of that agreement, they said that Newark had to form an oversight body. Didn't say what kind of oversight body, but said we need to form an oversight body. And that came about because after almost a decade of reviewing internal affairs documents and audits, there were only two cases that were founded by the internal affairs. In all these years, only two cases that they upheld. And we know that there has to be something suspicious about that, right? Given the amount of complaints and the amount of money that the city was forking over to people because of lawsuits, that there were only two complaints. So they said we need an oversight body. A Civilian Complaint Review Board does not hold officers criminally negligent. This is the work of the prosecutor's office. So when people try to confound the two purposefully, or conflate the two, purposely, it's not true. So if a police officer is involved in a criminal act or is even involved in a shooting, the prosecutor's office takes over. In the state of New Jersey, we now have independent investigation over police shootings on a state level. Right, so what Civilian Complaint Review Boards do in essence is monitor patterns and practices of individual police officers and of the department itself. So someone like Officer Chauvin, who killed George Floyd heinously in broad daylight, in public view, for millions of people to see, who had, as was stated, multiple complaints against him, multiple complaints. A Civilian Review Board would have been able to prayerfully a solid and strong review, but we've prayerfully been able to capture him before he committed murder and make a recommendation that he's removed from the police department before he even got into a situation where that happened. So it acts as an early warning strategy to begin to grab people who are aberrant in the very beginning. And I know we have a lot of discussion about good police and bad police, but the system of policing in Newark, yes, in this country is flawed. It's problematic, right? Because when people can commit these acts without any redress, then there's something wrong, right? Something wrong systemically. And so this review board gives us an opportunity to create that kind of environment where we begin to dismantle and mitigate issues in a system that supports police officers who violate people's constitutional rights and hide it and do all kinds of other things, right? So that's why it becomes important for us to support. Lastly, every organization, body, institution has legitimate oversight. They have oversight. Even the military has oversight, has civilian oversight. The police have to have civilian oversight as well, right? And that civilian oversight comes in the form of a civilian complaint review board. And, so the speakers and the panelists did an eloquent job in explaining why they support it. I think the Assemblywoman McKnight did an incredible job in outlining what the legislation would avail. And I think the legislation will be groundbreaking for us here in the state of New Jersey. And it's permissive, as she said, meaning that everybody doesn't have to have it, but people who definitely want it can. And that becomes important. The question that I have, for you, and I'm going to turn it over to the audience, is what do you think are the obstacles in the way now of us having a kind of review board that we need? And if you don't want to talk about that, or if somebody else answers that, you can also talk about specifically some of the things that you are hoping that a review board would do for community police relations in your city.
I personally think that one of the obstacles that stands in the way of having this legislation adopted with the teeth that is needed has to do with the very powerful labor unions that represent police officers. And labor unions have to do what they have to do for their membership. But I think that at the end of the day, that we have to get to a place where we convince police officers and the unions that represent them that this is not anti-policing legislation. It's about protecting both sides. It's about transparency. And I believe that if communities, cities like Plainfield, had the ability to create a CCRB and chose to do it, I think it would be a very effective tool to provide an additional layer of protection to our citizens, and the transparency that is needed would be there. And if we have officers who are doing their jobs according to the oaths that they took to protect and to serve, there's nothing that good officers have to worry about. But those that are bad must be held accountable, and we must have the investigatory powers to subpoena and to look deeply at the cause of those incidents where officers have been accused of police misconduct.
Anybody else? Anybody?
I'm encouraged by the fact that Mayor Baraka elaborated on what a CCRB is, because I think one obstacle is uncertainty, or maybe even going as far as saying ignorance. People may not be aware of what a CCRB is, because it's a new concept here in New Jersey. However, it's not a new concept in the country, because in New York, our neighbor, they've had a CCRB for quite some time. My brother-in-law is a sergeant in the NYPD, so I often ask him how it has worked in his city, and we exchange notes, and that's why one of the reasons why I think, as far as accountability is concerned, we should establish a board, because we've seen it work elsewhere. And if it's a matter of just explaining to the public what it actually does and what it means, then perhaps you can surmount that obstacle.
I think you heard me talk about otherness, this us versus them mentality. And I am a proponent of public safety officers, teachers, people who are involved in our socialization institutions living within a certain radius in the community. We wouldn't necessarily be in this place if the people who served and are supposed to protect our community lived in our communities. And it makes that otherness, it makes it okay to dehumanize people when they don't know you. So that's one obstacle, but we also need to understand how we got to this place, why people feel the need to be included, because we have been systematically excluded. I also think that this is important because we want to prevent gossip. We also want to prevent people speaking things into their community into existence. So we don't want to start believing that this is happening and this, oh yes, someone gets shot by a gun. Oh, now, gun violence, everybody's going to get shot. There's going to be random shootings. No, everybody needs to have an understanding as to how and why things are happening. They need to have details. They need to have stories, not conjecture, narratives, things that people just add just because they feel like it, because it just doesn't help in our public safety efforts. The other thing is, I think the power to subpoena and also expedite evidence saves us money. A lot of times these investigations, they take months and years, and we're left to pay for our officers to stay home until the investigation is concluded. And we don't think about that. You're not having answers, and you're still paying for someone that actually might have done something wrong. So I think our ability to help in the process and due process would actually be a reason why we should support this legislation. Thank you.
I'm going to go right to the floor. A couple of questions. I do want to thank all of the community. You have to step up here. All of the community advocates that are here that support and helped us. ACLU, obviously. All of the folks in Newark Anti-Violence Coalition, all of the people that are here, folks that are out here who supported and helped us get this done. I know People's Organization Progress. Larry Ham just walked all the way to Trenton. People don't know that. He done walked all. Most people didn't know he did that. I had to pray for him on his walk, but he did it. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm Brittany Claybrooks of East Orange and adopted by Plainfield. I just wanted to ask you, Mayor Baraka, what were some of the struggles that you had when it came to picking members, or how were your members chosen? How did they come to be? Because we know that we want things to happen. I heard you, Assemblywoman, when you talked about training of board members, and that's in the legislation. But a lot of times we don't talk about process,
right,
and that's important. So can you enlighten us on how that went?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So we worked with the local organizations, and we gave them the authority to pick people from those organizations to be on the review board. Local community-based organizations, NAACP, ACLU, folks like that. We did that for a minute. Obviously, it became a learning kind of curve for us, because there's multiple organizations who want to now say, I'm an organization, I want to put my person on there. And so we are creating a body now made up of organizations that get to actually a panel to look at the people who are qualified now to be on a review board. And I think the credentials that were put together in the legislation are exactly what we need. for a panel of folks. So and the desire is not for the people to be picked by the mayor, because there's this narrative that's out there that's wrong, that the mayor is going to pick people he wants, and so police officers who the mayor doesn't like are going to be under attack by the review board, when the whole community is under attack by police officers. But in any event, I think what we want to do is move politics out of it.
Right.
And so you put community organizations on a panel to empanel them and empower them to begin to select people based on the credentials and the criteria that are put forth in the legislation.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mimone Christian. Mayor Baraka, thank you for moderating this forum. I've been following your leadership since you were a student leader at Howard University, our alma mater. And you know. And you're a gem to the state of New Jersey, and you don't get the credit that you deserve.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
And I want to thank you all who are here today in the panel who are at the forefront of pushing this legislation. It is definitely needed. I'm from a small shore town in central New Jersey, and how can you teach this model and garner support in small suburban towns that don't think they have a problem? And where can we find sample resolutions in language to present to townships? Thank you.
So I do want to say before they speak that there are small towns who have been contacting us and other folks about establishing review boards in their communities, all waiting in the wings to see what happens on a state level. So anybody want to respond to what she said? How do you get convince people in small towns to support this kind of legislation, and is there any language that she can use?
I have some action items.
Yo, do it.
That's going to be hard.
That's what we need.
So I have action items. As of right now, we have nothing, right? We do not have a CCRB in place. So one of the things that I am asking all of you to do is to go to the state website, www.nj.leg.state.nj.us, and I want you to look up A4656 and download this legislation and read it. I want you to become familiar with this legislation. Then I want you to share this piece of legislation on your social media platforms. Send out via your email. I want you to allow other people to know what we are up against. Also, go to your city council and ask them to present a resolution in support of this legislation. You can reach out to the mayor back here and get their resolution, and you can use that as a blueprint. Then I also want you to reach out to your assembly members and your state senators and ask them, do they support this piece of legislation? When this legislation gets to the floor, we need 41 votes from the assembly out of 80, and we need 21 votes on the Senate side out of 40, so that it can get to the governor's desk. I want you to do an email campaign. Flood our email, because I get flooded plenty of times when people are against or for a piece of legislation. Flood our emails and ask your assembly people and your senators, where do they stand with this piece of legislation? And for the elected officials, whether you are a board member or a mayor or a council, I want you to use your social media platform, your email platform, and publicly state that you support this piece of legislation. Do Facebook Live, Instagram Live, Twitter Live, TikTok, and ask. That's right, because I want you to reach 9 million people in the state of New Jersey. When we work together collectively, we can move this piece of legislation. And I'm looking forward to having those resolutions from the small towns, from the large towns, so then that will give me ammo when I'm on the floor, because I know I'm going to have to debate this on the floor to get votes. So this is what we do. This is how we're doing it. We hear so much information about COVID. We need to hear so much information about CCRB. We need to hear so much information about accountability. We need to hear so much information about domestic violence. So the CCRB is here. I want it to pass. I need you to help me to get it passed. And we need 41 votes and 21 votes so that we can get this to the governor's desk. And then when it gets to the governor's desk, I need you to reach out to the governor's office and ask him if he supports this. So those are my action items.
That was great. So the resolution, you can get the Assemblywoman McKnight's resolution. You can download it. She gave you the information. I'm going to ask her before it's over to give that information again. That was pretty complex. So people could download it. And you could go to the city of Newark and get our resolution as well. I would reach directly out to the Corporation Counsel's office in City Hall to get the actual resolution, the ordinance, that was passed in the city of Newark. Any other questions? No questions. Oh, here comes somebody.
My question is real easy. Where's the pushback? Where do we get that? I really don't love you. I can't handle you. Where's that type of pushback coming from? Is it just plain mayors, some mayors, assembly, senate? Where's the pushback?
Well, right now, as was stated earlier, I think Mayor Mapp stated it, that obviously it's coming from the FOP organization that is pushing back against this statewide. And to be honest with you, it's not even really a loud and hard push. And there are legislators who are on the fence or who don't agree. And so it's necessary, as the Assemblywoman said, to make sure the legislators know, one, they're informed, and two, that they know that it's supported by their constituency at the same time. That way we can get this bill through and it becomes law in the state of New Jersey. I think really what we should be concentrating on is what our Assemblywoman said, is how do we galvanize ourselves to make the bill a reality, more than people who are pushing back against that. There are going to be people who are against everything. There's not one thing you do that you're not going to find somebody that's against. That's for sure. I mean, you think you're doing the greatest thing in the world, there'll be people out there telling you you're not. So at the end of the day, our focus has to be on how to get this done. Anybody else want to say anything about that before we move on? I'm surprised that Mayor Sayer hadn't gotten up here yet, man. I'm getting ready to check his pulse, make sure he up here. Come on, yes.
Hi, I'm from the ACLU, and I just want to thank everybody for your amazing work. But I had a question that I get asked all the time about training for people on the CCRB, and I know that New York's done some really great work on that. Could you tell us a little bit more and how training's addressed in your bill? Yeah. Thanks.
So this is going to be optional. So municipalities can have the CCRB members trained from the AG office or something that's compatible, like Nicole. And in the bill, we outline that. So if you find an organization with the right credentials on training, CCRBs, you can check out, New York, then the option will be able, you will be able to utilize the AG's office or another reputable organization for training. So it's optional, which is great. That's another option.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to pass a comment. I've heard a few comments about New York CCRB.
Right.
And I practice civil rights law in New York and New Jersey, and I've had several interactions with the New York City CCRB. And to put it mildly, there's much to be desired there. A lot of attorneys that do civil rights work in New York don't even encourage their clients to go through the CCRB anymore because the way it's set up can, one, be very traumatizing to someone making a complaint. can be seen as a formality. I mean, I've heard CCRB interviews where an investigator just asks a bunch of leading questions to the victim and then says it's not sustained. I think we can be better. And I think that, to the extent that, there's a lot of intention behind this, and I absolutely love it, and it already sounds like a better iteration of New York City. I think we just have to keep that in mind, that we have to build on what they're doing, because the CCRB in New York City leaves much to be desired to a lot of people.
Yeah. And the questions. Some of the training, just added, one of the important things is confidentiality. We train on that, as was stated by assembly person, because some people get on these boards and they believe because they have information, their duty is to share everything they know to everybody, right? So they get on social media, they start threatening, they saying this, they saying that. But what you're actually doing is undermining the authority of the board itself. You're undermining the power, the ability of the board to do its job, right? You think that your job is to get on there and be this lone kind of person that tells everything that's going on, but what you're doing is really weakening the board. And so we train on confidentiality, we train on, a myriad of different things, but I wanted to say that specifically because it goes directly to what Assemblywoman McKnight talked about in terms of what sanctions would be for folks on the board who do that. And that is one of the concerns that people use to create the kind of fodder to make sure review boards don't happen, right? And we need that to happen, and we need folks to be trained on those boards. Go ahead, sir.
Good morning, Mayor. Donald DeAugustine, I'm councilman in Hillside. Good morning, Mayor. My concern, and I'm absolutely 100% supportive of this, I think it's something that needs to happen. I think an ounce of prevention, it's a pound of cure. But what I've seen, and what I hope this bill has, is when recommendations are made, subpoenas are done, we still have to get a police chief or someone to compel or to listen to the results of the investigation and implement what you want to happen. Because this is like study in committee. It's great, but we need to have that step that, a lot of times with chiefs, they've got this protection because, you can't meddle politics or influence into the police department. And that gives them like absolution from a decision that a council like that would make. And my concern is we need in that legislation that when the review board gets the information, does the subpoenas and has a compelling case and you come up with a recommendation, these whoever's in charge of that department needs to follow through on it.
Yep. So I'm gonna let Assemblywoman, if she wants to speak to that. The subpoena and recommendation are two different things. Subpoenas are upheld by the court. So if you don't respond to a subpoena, the court can enact sanctions. That's number one. That's like any subpoena. If the state assembly could subpoena you. If you decide not to come, then they can go to court and get sanctions. In terms of the recommendation, the Assemblywoman said 60 days. If they do not follow the recommendation of the review board, they have to come before the review board or present to the review board why they in fact did not follow those recommendations. And I think that would be, that's different than what I've seen anywhere in the country, in fact.
And to add on that, the CCRB will be able to provide change recommendations for policies. So if all the recommendations are always knocked down, that's a trend, right? So then we will have to look at that. Why every time we give you this particular recommendation, you knock it down? So now we need to change your policy on that. So the piece of legislation will allow the CCRB to do that. And this is why we want to give them 60 days, and then they have to come to the CCRB to present why they're not going with their recommendation. And then we have documentation, and over time, if legislation needs to be changed, like the mayor said over here, then we need to change it.
So the AG guideline stipulates that the only person that has the ability to enact discipline upon police officers is the chief of police, right? So, and that also begs the question, why hasn't the Attorney General, like the Attorney General can act, the State Attorney General can act on all of this immediately, can basically, based on AG guidelines, can say, you have to turn your documents over. You have to go before the CCRB. The AG can do that, but I think the law solidifies and makes it stronger, so we don't have to depend on people's individual policy or individual well-being. We can have a law that basically says you have to do these specific things regardless of what your personal opinion is about it. You had something, Sharif?
Sharif from Menhotep, Newark Anti-Violence Coalition. My question was, is there anywhere in the law, when we do get the law, the CCRB, would it run retroactive? Like, is anything in that retroactive? I think that's important. It's a lot of officers still on the force that, because we didn't have that CCRB, their cases can be looked into.
So that's a good question. And with any piece of legislation, the question is, do we have concurrent investigation in the piece of legislation, retroactive? So yes, retroactive, yes. So any case that may have been misled information, the CCRB can definitely go back and review those cases. So to your answer, yes.
Well, I'm going to allow the panel here to give us some closing remarks since there's no other questions, and close us out here. We can begin on this side with Assemblywoman.
Getting a lot of steps in this morning. So I just want to end. Thank you so much for being here. And I want you to go onto the state website and download the legislation and read it for yourself. Because many times people will tell you what they think. But I want you to read it to yourself, so when you get pushback, you can say, no, line number 15 on page 2 states this. And then begin to educate your peers and your family. And always remember, when we work together, we can move forward. As of right now, we have no CCRB. So let's work together so that New Jersey can be the leading force in making sure that we have a qualified CCRB in place so that we bring in accountability and transparency against all spectrums. Thank you.